Sometimes when we begin to question our faith or have doubts about our tradition, it can feel like we are wandering out into the desert. When we take a step back and honestly evaluate organized religion in the 21st century, many times it doesn't make any sense. The more we cling to it and try to save it, the worse it becomes. In addition, widespread abuse, cover-ups, and victim shaming cause some of us to question whether it will ever be right again.
The Desert Sanctuary was created by Karl and Laura Forehand. It consists of a podcast, a blog, along with Karl and Laura's writing.
We're happy you're here. Welcome to the show. Hi, welcome to the Desert Sanctuary. We're grateful that you are with us today. I'm Laura Forehand. I almost forgot my name for a second.
Well, I even have it on the screen now. I changed the thing where it displays right now. So
that's true.
You should just look at the screen
to see what my name was. But anyway, I'm here today, and I'm here with Karl Forehand, and we have a great podcast that we're getting ready to do. So I'm excited. But was there anything you wanted to share before we dive in?
It really doesn't work out good with the announcements because, like I want to say, our book's on sale, but it won't be on sale by the time this comes out in early March. So never mind that. But go ahead and buy the book if you want to.
Yeah.
It's still doing well, still in the top 50. It's been there for quite a while. We're grateful for that. We can't quite explain it, but I think since people are curious about it and so on.
Curious, but hopefully it's resonating.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to let people know is we've been, kind of over the past few years while we've been writing and doing podcasts and doing Leaning Forward Conference and all those things, we've kind of been building up a YouTube library. So the other day we had 97 subscribers and I made a big plea and it went up to like 103 and then back down to 102. So I don't know how to promote things like that, but there's a lot of content out there. There's all those Leaning Forward speakers, like 30 or 40 speakers over the couple of years that we've done it.
Yeah.
There's kind of things that were intended to be courses for our books that are, just...
They're out there. Yeah,
they're just out there. There's just a lot of stuff like that you might find valuable. Plus, we're starting to take the... podcast interviews in vocal form, audio form, and put them out there with a picture. It's not in any way video, but those should be interesting too because the services kind of roll off your podcast, and it's kind of hard to get to them after a while. So, anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk with Maria, about her story and her book. And so, why don't you lead us in with the bio?
Yeah. So. This is Maria Francesca French, and I'm going to read the bio. It's like in her words. Okay. So it says, I am a native New Yorker who is now living in the UK from Newport Beach, California, by way of Minneapolis and the south of France. I travel often to speak and teach, but also to discover new things, people, and places. I love Instagram and cocktails. I love that. I learn as much as I can when I can. I'm curious about a lot and am always asking the next question. I love my life, even the parts that are sometimes hard to love. I march to the beat of my own drum. My heart is pastoral, and I love to teach scripture, theology, and what it means to engage faith in the 21st century. My favorite word is lover, and in the words of Marilyn Monroe, I am very definitely a woman, and I enjoy it. I am married to an absolutely singular man who I deeply love and adore. European cathedrals are my happy place and beauty is my home. And I wanted to mention her book before we say hello. It's called Safer Than the Known Way, A Post-Christian Journey. So welcome, Maria, to the podcast. We're very thankful that you're with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for that welcome. And thank you for that bio. So I just want to apologize for not sending a formal bio. That is something that you grabbed from the homepage of my website. And it's so fun that you read it because the only place it's listed is the homepage of my website. Nobody has ever actually read that out loud on anything. And so it was just very fun because that was something, it's like, hey, if you want me in a messy little nutshell and you're kind of arriving to the place where someone, if they want to read about me or learn about my projects that I'm involved in, where they go, that is the very first thing that they will encounter. So it's like, this is me. And if you like this, then scroll down and keep reading and you'll get some more meaty things. So thanks so much for, reading that. That was really fun.
Absolutely. So I just have to ask an off-topic question. So you're a native New Yorker and so am I.
Yes, I read that in your book.
Yeah.
Rochester.
Yes, Rochester, New York I was born in Buffalo, New York, and raised until I was 13 in Rochester. So where are you from?
I was born and raised on Long Island.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I had grandparents that lived in the Bronx, New York. So
So I've been obviously all over New York and the city and the boroughs. I used to live in Brooklyn for a short while and I worked in Manhattan, and I go back to New York often because all my family is still there and I'm always in the city. But I have long been out of New York in terms of a resident. And so my Long Island accent is pretty gone. But when friends come over and, especially I'm living in the UK now, they want a little of that New York girl. So I do my best to sort of turn it on and turn it up.
Isn't that interesting how we do that? Because I grew up, once I turned 13, we moved to Texas. And so it's funny when I go visit my sister who still lives there. It's very easy to kind of get that Texas twang back.
Always easy,
I live in the Midwest. Mm-hmm. So anyway, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Maria, we're glad you're here. And I've read your book all the way through. It's been about a month we're talking about before the show started. But can you tell us in whatever detail you want? We just want to hear your story in your own words and in as much detail as you want to tell us. Then we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. My story isn't an uncommon one. Before I can talk about the evangelical part of it, as we just spoke, I grew up on Long Island, New York. I was born into a very Italian-American family. Everybody was Catholic, and being Catholic was more than a faith. If it even was a faith, it was more of a cultural understanding of how you understood yourself within a community of people and mores and traditions and just all sorts of cultural language that people understood. And so you just went to a parish. It's sort of what you did. You made the sacraments. Even if you didn't really understand transubstantiation as a 7-year-old, you knew you were making your first Holy Communion. You were wearing a white dress, a veil. It was important, but you don't really sort of ask questions. But, the first chapter, my book, I'm sure we'll talk about my book. The book was and is meant to be a tool for people who are finding themselves past traditional notions of God, for it to be a place that they can go to and access and really find what comes next after Christianity, after very traditional and accepted and historical constructs of God, after some of those things fail. What is next after the false and sort of devastating binaries of theism and militant atheism? There's got to be another way of engaging faith in between those two constructs. And so that is primarily what the book addresses. However, in the first chapter of my book, it's pretty autobiographical. And so, someone could go there and read a little bit about my life. And while my life could be a book in and of itself, I'm not sure how interested anybody would be in that. But I did want to make the first chapter of a book that is fairly theological, a little bit about my life, because I think it's so important to tell your story so that people can sort of find some sort of camaraderie, some sort of resonance, some sort of, I identify with that part of her story, or I understand that. And that's where I am at too. I wanted people to understand where I was coming from as I'm kind of leading them down new theological and philosophical and ecclesial and communal and faith paths. So my very first faith home was Catholicism. And I remember making the sacraments, like I said, and walking into these parishes and just sort of looking up and around and just being so mystified and enchanted by what I felt was in there, which was something very holy, something you had to be quiet for and have reverence for and have a holy fear, of. And, I remember kind of hearing the the hymnals like be placed down on the pews. And I remember hearing the clanging of sort of the metal incense holder as it was being swung around by the priest. And I remember the slamming shut of the confessional booths, very visceral, like sensory, engagement of this, but I didn't really know what to call it. I mean, people said it was God, there was Jesus on the cross, there was the Virgin Mary statue, but all the pieces really weren't coming together. I just knew that I was very curious as to what was happening here. And when I was about 12 or 13, my mom moved us on to an evangelical charismatic church on Long Island. And that's sort of where I really fully immersed myself in a very traditional evangelical experience. So youth group culture, going to the altar, giving my life to Christ, missions trips, retreats, camps, charismatic worship, purity culture. I know you guys talked a little bit about that in your book. I went to a public high school, so I started a Bible club. I was a singer and theater person in junior high and high school. And so every time I sang anything that was about God, it was some CCM song or whatever. And I was just fully immersed in that, Jesus is my best friend, my boyfriend, my savior, sort of my everything. You're praying all the time, you're having those personal devotions, and nothing is more important than this relationship. And then gradually, I moved on to university. I went to the Midwest for that. I went to a Bible college, and it was fully Assembly of God Pentecostal. And that is when like the full charismatic Pentecostal expression of my faith sort of came to the fore. And I was involved in tons of ministry, like tons. Was very, very ministry oriented, was very Jesus focused, and always out of curiosity. When I moved from Catholicism to evangelicalism, it was, okay, well, now I could put a face to my curiosity. I could put a name to it. It's Jesus. Oh, this makes sense. And I was still more curious, like, what's behind the veil? How do I get closer? And then when I, engaged Pentecostalism, it was like, oh, all of these gifts. Okay. Speaking in tongues and giving words of knowledge and praying through the night and, being sensitive to the Spirit and these kinds of things. Okay, that's how I get closer. That's how I learn more. That's how I get higher and deeper and all of these things. And then, I eventually went to seminary, and I kind of had sort of finished a bit. And by that, I mean, I'm in my mid-20s now, and I've sort of moved past a little bit of those really intense Pentecostal expressions of faith. And I found myself getting very progressive evangelical. I was asking a lot of questions about justice and, the LGBTQI plus community. At that point, this was years ago now. But it was still state legislated, gay marriage. And at the time, Minnesota was up on the ballot for gay marriage. And I remember that being a really big deal. And, at that point, I was an ally, and I was supporting the queer community. And that was a real problem for a lot of people in my evangelical circles. I was actually an adjunct professor at the time at a Christian university. And I was asked to stop teaching because I had become an ally. And, so I grew very progressive evangelical. And then eventually I didn't feel the need for that evangelical piece at all. And I became post-evangelical. And then, as people read in the book, I eventually, I just turned 40 last month. So I'm giving you like the last 40 years of my life in a few minutes. But, about, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so ago, I found myself in this post-Christian, post-theist space, which essentially is, there's a reason why I say post-theist as opposed to atheist or even agnostic, because I'm still engaging God. I'm just past, traditional sort of understanding of what that means. And it is very important to me that I continue to engage Christianity, but I'm engaging it very differently now. And it's taken me the last decade. I've since then I've gotten all sorts of new degrees in education under my belt. I've done a ton of reading and research and writing and moving and different ministry roles and vocations. I've worked in the academy. I've worked in church contexts. I've worked in denominational leadership. I've traveled and taken really big breaks while I've lived abroad and needed to do stuff. I mean, the last 10 years of my life have just been really incredible. And so in a sense, this book is really the culmination of all of that. How did I get to this place? But it's more than just my story, really. It's an invitation to others who feel like after they've left, whether it's evangelicalism or just Christianity in the West or the US in general, so many people feel like, especially at a pop culture level, well, I have nothing to do but become an atheist now because I don't believe in this God as is. So it must be nothing. Nothing else is offered to me. Or at the very least, I'm an agnostic. I'm certain that there's something out there, but I don't know what, and I'm just happy to sort of live there. And that's all fine if someone feels peace about being in those philosophical and theological places. But in my experience, and I have a lot of it, people don't actually want to be in those places. They feel pigeonholed into them. Like those are the only options. There are two categories: believe or don't believe. And I actually indict the concept of belief in my book quite a bit. And I talk about why. So post-Christianity is a way of not even saying, hey, here's what's between those two things. It's a way of hopping the spectrum, the continuum altogether, and saying we can do so much better than going back and forth on this sort of, polarity continuum. We need to hop this track altogether and ask different questions of all of this stuff, meaning making and storytelling and Christianity and God and community and faith and church and how we know anything that it is we know, and how does it all intersect with, culture and society and history and the times in which we live in our own humanity and what it looks like to live into that. And, it's just so much more than we ever even probably had imagination for that faith could be, or religion could be, or that sort of thing. So, that's me, that's my life. And at the moment, that's my book.
Yeah, and so I'm curious, and I think I remember in your book, and actually a couple of these quotes that I wrote down have that in it. But one of the central issues that we all deal with right away is that we have to deal with certainty, right? Mm-hmm. And in our need for certainty, and that's what puts us in those, dualistic kind of battles. Is I want to be certain, and I thought today about the tens of thousands of Protestant denominations that are all certain about what they believe and that God is on their side.
Yeah.
But there's 14 to 33,000 depending on who you listen to. So I'm kind of fascinated with the word post-Christian right now. I tried to discuss it with my daughter, and she didn't like the term because she didn't want Christian in the name that describes her.
Sure.
And I said, well, it's post or past, my director of missions in the Southern Baptist Convention talked about being in a post-Christian era.
Yeah.
10, 12 years ago, even though he will never pursue anything like this. So what are those notions that you feel like you've gone beyond, those notions about the past or what's keeping us stuck? You said those traditional notions of Christianity or about God. What are some of those things that you move beyond?
Yeah, I'd love to answer that question. Just really quickly, first, I want to address what you said about the post-Christian and the Southern Baptist piece. Traditionally, the term post-Christian has been used to denote, a turn into secular culture, a turn into godless culture, that sort of thing. So I am using it in a deeply subversive and contrasting way. And I talk about, I think it's in chapter 7, why the post and post-Christian, why the Christian and post-Christian, why those two words are important and how they could be helpful. And, like your daughter, I'm sure it's not for everyone. I'm sure there are a lot of people who don't want to be associated with Christianity more, and that makes a lot of sense. And everyone has to sort of do what's right for them. My book isn't evangelistic in terms of, hey, call yourself post-Christian. It's like, hey, if this seems like you, and if you're identifying with what I'm saying, maybe this might be a cool place for you to hang for a while you figure stuff out. I do a lot of theological coaching, and sometimes I have people come to me and they're just like, I really want to be an atheist and I want to work some of this stuff out of my system. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. Let's do that. So yeah, that's really why I kind of use that language post-Christian. But in terms of your question about traditional notions, I mean, a really good example of this, and something I talk a lot about in the book, among other examples, is the existence of God, the actual being of God, talking about God in terms of a metaphysical being, a supernatural one, A phrase that I use a lot is the God who lives in the sky,
Mm-hmm.
who actually has personhood and being and is an object, albeit, a transcendental one, omnipresent, omniscient, all of these things. And when sometimes, and a lot of times what we're seeing this in mass exodus, signing on to an existence of that kind of God is just too much for people. And I talk about, some of the events that kind of led it to be too much for people in my book. I pick out 4 main events in the 20th century. And so once people kind of get to the end of, I can't believe in this type of God anymore that exists in this way, again, they kind of go off the edge and they go, well, I guess I'm an atheist. And what I'm saying is you don't actually have to sign on to that kind of belief. You don't actually have to decide for yourself or for anyone else, for the world, for history, for anyone or anything, whether or not the existence of God is an empirical reality or not. That's not actually the point. And I talk about the importance of theological understanding of some of this stuff and theological transformation, and how that is really kind of what we are after if we want to engage any of this stuff anyway, is, renewal and rebirth and, transfiguration and reimagination and all of these things. Not necessarily does God exist like this or this. Did this actually happen or did this not happen? Like those are just really dated ways of talking about stuff. And in the world in which we live, where there is just no one singular reality, there's just not, there's a multiplicity of stories, there's a multiplicity of narratives. And that means that there's not just one singular solution. And there's not one singular way of talking about something as huge and ineffable and immaterial as everything that we've housed in this little noun of God. So that's one way of moving past some traditional notions. And again, I know it's not for everyone, but
So I remember you mentioning, and you've kind of covered this already, but if we just move to a more progressive view of God, or even if we move to atheists, which is atheist, against God, against Theo, then I remember you saying in the book that it's the same metaphysical God.
It is, yeah.
That you're either for or against, or you think he's better or kinder or more gentle, right? So, moving away from that, let me just read this, okay?
Yeah.
It's an adventure, you say, dark, strenuous, and mind-blowing. It introduces us to a new way of being, which is a life of uncertainty. And it liberates us from constructs that we didn't know were constructs until we did. Right?
Yeah.
And so
after reading your book, I know that you guys probably resonate a little bit with that statement. Yeah.
And so to me, what it looks like in my mind is, well, somebody wants me to take a fork in the road kind of choice. You're going to be liberal or conservative. You're going to be progressive or evangelical, conservative, whatever the terms are. But here's my deal, Maria. Let me you can just counsel me maybe or something.
You counsel me, Karl.
We were a pastor and pastor's wife for 20 years, 3 churches. They all went well. It was church planting type of stuff. And at one point I stood up and said, I can't do this anymore. I'm starting to deconstruct my faith and trying to do that from the pulpit. And it only works for a little while. Sure. And then it didn't work anymore. So then I found some people, semi-famous people that could feed me books and read Richard Rohr, and stuff like that. And, became conscious of some things and then deconstructed even more. But then some of these people that even were helping me in the beginning decided to go back to almost a Greek Orthodox kind of thing, or a progressive church, and they dove back in.
Yeah, I've seen that happen a lot.
And so then we've noticed when we keep going that even Laura and I sometimes aren't deconstructing, aren't realizing the same things. And so it's like nobody online can see my hands, but it's like we're going down a whole bunch of different paths. And then I noticed those will cross and we'll resonate with each other. And then, but the key word again is certainty or uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk some more about that? That, it's not that we're going to be able to form a new club.
Yeah.
And get members to the club, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these conversations are just so complex and so complicated because they're so multi-layered and they're so filled with so much baggage, not your baggage or my baggage, although that's certainly here, but it's like just the baggage of like the whole conversation happening in the West, in the US, about Christianity and what's happening, especially in these deconstruction circles. I mean, yeah. So in no particular order, and this is not an exhaustive list, but just some things that come to mind. One thing I think that we need to be aware of that we're not always aware of is that, and I talk about this in my book, what does it look like to engage Jesus after Christianity, essentially post-Christianity? What do we do with Jesus? What do we do with this relationship we had with him or that we thought we had with him? What do we do with claims of like savior of the world and, forgiver of sins and this kind of thing, eternal life giver, all of these things, and I think sometimes, when we're coming from a context where I'm just using this as an example, where we feel so close to the person of Jesus and he's been all of these things to us. We're taught that, it is very much an individualistic quest, right? God has a plan for our life. Jesus wants us to be saved. Jesus is going after the one. He's leaving the 99 and going after the one. And these are very sort of, very subtle and sort of insidious, individualisms that have crept into Christianity over the last, I would say, 250 years in the West that has really started to critically and gravely undermine the communal aspect of Christianity. And we don't always realize that, right? So we say we're deconstructing and then we leave whatever form of Christianity we're a part of, liberal or conservative or whatever, but we still take that individualistic quest to that next stage of faith, even if it's in deconstruction. So all of a sudden, we still want to know what's in it for us, how, we're going to move past this, how we are going to be healed, what life holds for us. And these aren't bad questions to be asking. I've asked them, you ask them, we all ask them. But we're kind of moving, one focus that is very much on us and God to another focus that's very much on us and the next thing. And part of that is the individualistic piece. Part of that is we are moving one loyalty of certainty to another loyal of certainty. Maybe that loyalty of certainty is just bigger. And it's why progressive Christians are so quick to indict and to criticize evangelicalism and conservative Christianity and fundamentalism. And I get that because there's a lot wrong with it. It's really toxic. But what they don't always understand is, and you alluded to this and I talk about it in my book, is that they're doing the same thing. Their God is just nicer. Their God just plays for the other team. So they've still made a God in their image, the one that lives in the sky, the metaphysical, supernatural God being. But this God is anti-racist, and this God is, open and affirming, and this God is, everything good and everything noble that we value. Essentially, taking a liberal politic and applying it to God. Now, are these great values to have? Absolutely. I'm all of those things and more. Those are the values I hold. But I'm very careful not to attribute them to who I might think God is or who I believe Jesus to be. And I think we need to hold all of this very loosely. And we also need to tread with a very intentional and abiding sense of humility, with the sense that we just don't know everything. And that doesn't mean we can't wonder and suspect and study about Jesus and who he might have been and, even commune with Jesus or what we believe to be the spirit of Jesus if we want to, if that is someone's desire. But we have to be very careful not to just build something back up in our own image. There's a lot of talk of deconstruction and reconstruction. And what I'm talking about in my book, and I think ultimately going back to the quote that you just read, what I would ask of people is that they wouldn't reconstruct something so quickly or even ever, because the post-Christian piece really is a life of no guarantees. It's a life of patience for something that might not ever arrive, but always waiting with the anticipation for what might arrive that we simply cannot see coming. It's this moment that might break into our life as event. And a lot of radical theologians, and I talk a lot about radical theology and deconstruction and Jacques Derrida and the death of God in my book, because I think it's really important for sort of understanding what I'm vying for as post-Christianity. And I think there's some really helpful things in there theologically and philosophically as we move out of some of this stuff that has sort of held us really tightly for a very long time and liberating us, to use the word that you quoted. But yeah, it's just this sense that we just don't know everything that there is to know. And I don't know, I'm sort of rabbit trailing now, so I think I'll stop. But it's more than just not knowing everything that there is to know. It's having a sense that none of this can ever be nailed down. And radical theologians will say, God is actually the event of God. So what we've done is we've crystallized event and we've held it up as like solidified, cemented, universal absolute image, as opposed to saying, okay, I'm waiting for the next time event breaks into my life again. And so I think we need to be really careful of that. And I think there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of crystallization happening, even after we've deconstructed from one very toxic understanding of God. We've recrystallized event. And sometimes that's a nicer God, or sometimes it's not God at all. Sometimes it's just the word universe or love with a capital L or whatever. And that's all okay. I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying, as we do those things, let us know what it is we're doing. Let us be very aware of what it is we're doing when we do those things. So, how I started this sort of long, windy answer. It's complex. It's complex. And like you said, you a moment ago, you said if people could see my hands, they'd be winding around, and mine too, because that's essentially how these conversations can feel sometimes. Because also we have to remember that we are essentially attempting to speak of the unspeakable, right? And so we do our best, and this is our best. And that's why it sounds like windy little roads and feels like it too.
Yeah. And sometimes the uncertainty of it all feels unsafe.
Indeed.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of where I fall. Like, I think when we were in evangelical Christianity, everything was, projected as so certain, even though really there were a lot of times that the rules would change. And so it was very uncertain. But, and even the God that we worshiped every Sunday was uncertain, depending on, how much sin you had that week or whatever.
Sure.
Anyway, so yeah, I mean, for me, it's really being aware that I don't want to nail something down, but also there's a part of me that is like, I just want to have a little bit of certainty about all this. So it is very complex. I mean, yeah, I could totally resonate with everything you were saying, including just my brain goes in a bunch of different directions when it comes to the whole concept of God and Jesus and, what I believe and what I think. And anyway, so.
Yeah. And I just want to say that this is stuff like you guys, that I've been working out for the last 15 or so years of my life. This isn't something I decided I was going to do a couple of years ago, and then I've just done it. I've spent a lot of time in grief and mourning of, what once was for me. I've spent a lot of time pulling back out of church and out of community, not because I was upset with anyone or whatever. I just didn't want to go anymore. I have always been in theological settings. The tenure of my career has been in either theological institutions or ministry settings, usually higher up level ministry. So not in a local church, but, usually all days of the week, I was in some kind of theological context. And it was just another reason why I was like, church on Sundays, no. Like I need sort of a break. And so I went through like what I call a coasting period, and I was really okay with that. And for a long time, I was just such a people pleaser. And then I just was like, I don't care anymore. Like if people are going to be like, it's just been such a long journey of being okay with being like, I don't know. I know I'm not this and I know I'm not that. And I'm going to sort of resist the urge and the temptation to have to check a box. And if people don't understand my journey, that's okay. Hey, I think I'm going to go get a master's degree. I think I'm going to go get another one. I think I'm going to do my doctorate. I think I'm going to go live in France for a year and a half. I think I'm just going to like try and feel around in the dark and figure out what feels like a good fit. And, then I came across some philosophical and theological lenses and language that started to really make sense to me a little bit more. And so this is not something that I have done overnight. I think the first words of the preface of my book maybe is, I'm just someone who's lived to tell. And those words are very, very true.
Mm-hmm.
So
do you feel like this has kind of been who you have been all along, like even when you were in Catholicism and then evangelicalism? And do you feel like, oh gosh, I don't know, like, do you feel like you were like totally immersed in those particular denominations and programs and things like that? Or do you always feel like you were looking for, a deeper, more well-rounded understanding of, God, Jesus, the whole thing?
That's a great question. I mean, one thing I've sort of been really careful to do is to not throw out my own baby with the bathwater, in terms of, I look back on my faith and spiritual transitions and I say, you know what, that was a really fruitful time. Like the theology was off and I missed out on some things, and, that was a bummer that happened. But, I had some really happy times in those moments, and I had some really bedrock moments of understanding myself and the world. And that hasn't stopped. Like the thing that has been important to me and what I wanted to communicate in my book was that so many people feel like because they are leaving toxic forms of theology or church, that they have to sever their story and they have to break it apart and start over, and that everything that came before this moment, is just all trash and it doesn't matter. And I want people to know their stories absolutely matter. And it wasn't all for nothing. Yeah, maybe there were some bad parts of it and some unfortunate parts of it, but there would have been some bad and unfortunate parts of your life anyway, even if, that wasn't. Now, I have to say, I haven't come from contexts where I have been abused mentally or physically or emotionally. And I think that's another story. And I do mention that in my book. And I say, if there has been abuse that has happened, that needs to be dealt with in a court of law. People need to be held accountable, like those kinds of things. And same thing with trauma. I think there was a little bit of trauma there, but if people have had a real trauma where there's PTSD, like you need to be in therapy with a religious trauma specialist. Like I'm very passionate about those things. But for me, I can look back and say, yeah, that was really crazy that I spoke in unknown tongues for like 7 years every day. Mm-hmm. But it was great. And, I don't need to make a judgment call on that past part of my life. If someone else wants to, that's fine. But, I'm not going to do it. I've just moved past those expressions of faith being meaningful and meaning making for me. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. I'm not going to take it away from someone else. What I would argue about is someone else saying this is the only way to do it. And this is the litmus test. In my Assembly of God context, it was a litmus test, whether or not the Holy Spirit was in you. Right. If you spoke in tongues or did these things, it was a litmus test in my evangelical youth group, whether or not you had Jesus living in your heart and whether or not you were having sex or masturbating or whatever.
Right.
Catholicism, whatever, confession, praying the rosary, like, there's always something there. So I don't deny anybody their meaningful expressions of faith. The book was written, and the work that I do and have been doing for years now is for people who find themselves falling through the cracks and going through just a crazy amount of identity crisis. Because, when you're, and, not so much for progressive or liberal Christians because they find their identity in other ways, but mostly for evangelicals where they're told ad nauseum that who they are is who they are in God, and they have no identity apart from that. And when that God starts to break down and fade into the background and just completely vaporize, who are they? They're a ghost as well. They vaporize as well. And this is trauma. And this is just a massive identity crisis. They don't know what to do with their story, the trajectory of their story, or even their tomorrow, because God held it all. And now that God is nowhere to be seen. So yeah, I'm not coming for anyone or anyone's God.
Sure.
I'm there to lift people up who are really, really struggling in the loss of some of this stuff. So sorry, to go back to your original question, for me, I've seen it all as like a faith transition. I've seen it all as a curious person who was always bent in the direction of religion as a meaning-making mechanism. If I did not have that religion, like I can look back on my teenage years and clearly see some interests and some passions that didn't lie anywhere close to God, in terms of, I'm a writer, I'm an author now, but I was really interested in journalism and theater, and it was what I wanted to do. But, as a Christian at that level of things, you're taught to, do God's work and ministry. And this is the greatest thing that you could be doing. So there were some things that would have probably been a little bit different for me. But I don't regret my journey, and I certainly don't blame anyone for it. I just sort of look back on it, and I just sort of have this sense of like, I bless the journey, and I'm really happy with where I am at the moment. So
I think I'm learning to get there. I mean, I do think that I was very bitter, angry for so long.
Sure.
And like Karl would even say things like, it's all compost. And I was like, well, I don't want any part of that at all. I really don't. I don't see that anything beautiful can grow out of that compost. But I will say that, through like having open discussions like this, and through just doing some internal work, that I can see those things starting to, I can see myself starting to appreciate those parts of my journey, but also understanding who I was, in my younger years.
Yeah.
This isn't about me, but it's like, just taking those things into account, and perhaps, the way I was, the way my personality was, or, how I internalize things, can maybe speak volumes to then how I, was wounded by things in evangelical Christianity. But anyway, yeah. So it's, I love what you're saying, because I think it's just being open to the journey and knowing that your journey is not, there's nothing like, wrong with who you are on this journey.
Yeah.
And just trying to learn from it. So
yeah. And
I may take the rest of my life, but
no, and I love that you shared that, because I really appreciated some of what you said in the book as well. And I found it really meaningful. And I know you talked several times about some of the hurt you had with, some of the church women in your various congregations and things like that. And, I get it. I'm not trying to say that I haven't been left in the lurch by people, because I have been really, really betrayed by some people that I loved and that I was in relationship with for years. I entered into a marriage with a great guy that I shouldn't have been married to, and he shouldn't have been married to me. And we were unhappy for like 7 years of our marriage. He might say different, but I was unhappy, and I didn't feel like I could get out. And I wasted a lot of time being unhappy in a marriage that I shouldn't have been in. That was a product of, evangelical expectation and purity culture. And so there are things that I lost. I lost a lot of years of understanding sexuality and my understanding of my own self as a sexual being. And, purity culture is so damaging, talk about trauma. So I'm not trying to say like, oh, I learned something from it. It was like, there has been like really tough times and things I've had to reckon with. And in some sense, will always sort of walk with a little bit of a limp. From. And I understand, and I have a lot of empathy. And, to sort of keep my own sanity a little bit, and to sort of keep myself from becoming, bitter. I know you used that word. I could feel myself being bitter at different stages of the journey. And I was for a time, and that's okay. That it served me. That was an emotion I needed to have, and I needed to engage that. And, I think for so long, especially as women in the church, in the context that we've been in, this very conservative context, be the good girl, be the nice girl, like no display of emotion, like no heart on your sleeve. And not only that, but like, then you have the other expectation of, at least I did, of like, well, there's everyone else, and there's you, like you're the leader, like you're the one that's extra special. And then you take on all of these. And again, that American/Christian exceptionalism, which is also really damaging and toxic and really evil. And so I'm not trying to say there hasn't been really difficult moments that I wish hadn't have happened, but there's nothing for us to, sometimes we do just lose, sometimes we do just lose parts of our life. The redemption about that is that we have life in front of us, that we get to live differently. And that's why I just decided at one point, I'm going to get out of this marriage now. I know I'm going to lose people. I know people are not going to understand. Like there was no sign of that things were going badly, and he's a great guy. And I'm going to be like the crazy lady who went off the deep end and divorced this great guy for no good reason. Do you know what I mean? But it's like at some time you just have to tap out, and sort of that's what I did in a lot of areas. And I talk about that. I talk about my divorce in the first chapter of the book. I want people to know, like, hey, this is all that converged all at the same time. So yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think that the message that I'm getting from this podcast at all. I mean, I when you said reckon with, and I think that's huge. I mean, there's always going to be parts of our lives that we have to reckon with or heal. And I love what you said about the whole, I was bitter for a time, and and that's okay. Yeah. Like, I think all of this is just such an amazing and transformative message. So that saying all that, just, just thank you. Like, thank you for what you're doing and what you're sharing, because I think it's so important. And I do feel that, because so many of those messages are like, what you said, you're supposed to be the good girl. You're not supposed to be bitter. All those messages we get. And yet when we come out of it, a lot of times that's how we're feeling, but like you said, there's so much life in front of us. And that's such a beautiful message and a message of hope to give to people, I think. Anyway.
I think
thank you.
What you cannot do is you can't get rid of the inner child. You can't kill your inner critic. Yeah. All of that has to be integrated.
Yeah.
Through shadow work and things like that. That's the big word, is integrating it back in, so that you can respond instead of react, and you don't, you still get triggered by things. I want to just go a little bit further with what you and Laura have been talking about, because all the people in our inner circles now, and the people we interview on podcasts, when they talk about growth, or I would call it evolution, not reconstructing, like you said, and like you talked about in your book, but when they truly start to progress forward or evolve up, or whatever you want to call that. Some people even say leveling up.
Sure. That's okay.
Whatever. But all of them eventually start talking about these things that you guys touched on. They talk about going inside as a starting place, trusting yourself, beginning to become fully human. And a big word that all of them say in one way or another is that authenticity is one of the most important things.
Yeah.
Whether it's becoming who you were meant to be, or who you already are, coming back to yourself. That stuff is really important, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
We have, we asked this question to everybody. We didn't prepare you for it.
I'm ready.
That's how he prepares people, is by saying we haven't prepared.
I love it.
I love, we're both introverts, and, we, when I went through Toastmasters and some of those things to do extemporaneous speaking, when I used to have to speak for a minute or two, I literally just about died. I mean, I thought I was going to have a heart attack a few times, so anyway, I don't know how that relates, but so it's funny that I put people on the spot now and force them. I'm sure you can handle it. But if there was a billboard that you could write something on that everybody in the world would see, what would you write on your billboard? It could be a sentence or two sentences or just a phrase. What would you want everybody to hear about your philosophy, your way of life, or just what you want to communicate to them? What would you say?
Oh my gosh, this is a tough question, actually, because I'm so not an evangelist for the work I do. I literally exist my work exists for people who want it. I'm definitely not chasing a market or demographic or whatever. It's here if it can be helpful. So in terms of a billboard, oh God, yeah, this is tough. I think I've been asked a version of this question a lot on podcasts, always as like the final question, like what is the one thing you want to leave with people? I think that's sort of essentially what you're asking. And so while I don't have a phrase, I think the one thing that I would love for people to just hold close to their heart and like bet on is time. Is that all you have is time? It's the opposite of what one is usually indoctrinated with in very conservative fundamental circles of Christianity. Usually there's no time, right? The hour is late, time is running out, like repent, you might not be here tomorrow. You get in a car crash later, all of that ridiculous fear mongering and really kind of emotional manipulation, spiritual manipulation really is what it is. None of this has to be figured out today or tomorrow or next week. However long one's life is, it is yours. And you get to write your story. You get to figure out how you want to make meaning. And for some people, it's really helpful to continue to engage Christianity, but in really subversive ways, in really different ways, in ways that to some seem unorthodox and unusual, like myself, maybe. Some people want a complete break from it. Some people just don't want anything to do with it anymore. And those people, like you mentioned your daughter earlier, may not love the post-Christian phrase because they just don't want to be a part of that story anymore. And that is totally okay. Why is it okay? Because they have time to decide that, and they get to decide that they're in the driver's seat. And I think some of the trauma we walk away with in terms of Christianity is that we've believed in a God that is an interventionist one, that we're told intervenes into our lives in our behalf. And we're sort of like a puppet in that sense. We can't really make our own decisions. And then we're further told that our flesh is bad, but the spirit is good, and our humanity is weak, but, God is strong. And, once you move past a construct of an interventionist God and you realize that you are actually the one who is responsible for you and for your life and the story you want to tell in this world, whether it's tonight or the next 50 years. You have time and you have agency to do that. And I think a lot of times when we, for so many years, have relied on a certain type of agency when it comes to God, we don't credit our own agency near enough. And it's time to start doing that. Yeah. So maybe something along those lines, you guys.
Yeah, very good.
Your billboard can be as long and as big as you want it to be. Yeah. We did not say there was a space or a size constraint on your billboard. So that's really good. And
you're in control.
Yeah, you're in control. Which I think is really good. And probably that's probably what was a catalyst for my deconstruction, was just realizing that God wasn't intervening in the way that I was promised that he would. Right. And I think that our daughter echoes that. So, based on some of our life situations. But anyway, so I love that. I love what you said about that. So how can people get in touch with you or find your work?
Yeah. It's all on my website, which is mariafrancescafrench.com. I have a really active Patreon, in which I post new content, both written and audio every week. And I also do theological coaching on my Patreon as well. So if you need someone, not just someone, if you want to work with me, and just try and figure out what's next for you, like theologically, ecclesially, personally. I'm not a therapist. I'm a theological coach, and I can help people work some stuff out, because I think, after you've moved on from one set of vernacular, there's a very particular rhetoric, right? There's this insider Christian language. And again, when we're moving past some of those traditional contexts, we need new language. How do we know how we feel, but we don't really have words that can articulate that. And I help give articulation to some of that. And I try and do that in my book as well. But, I write in different places. I teach in different places. I do a lot of different things, and it all converges on my website. So if you want to figure out how to engage me, be in touch with me, or follow some of the work, it's all there.
Okay. And remind us again the title of your book and where can we find it?
Yeah. So the title of my book is Safer Than the Known Way, a post-Christian journey, published by Choir just this past January. You can go to Amazon. You can really go to any online bookseller, Target, Barnes & Noble. I think it's on Goodreads. So.
Awesome. Thank you.
Maria Francesca French, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, thank you.
We're going to get an applause thing one day. We'll put it in.
I love it.
We're so happy that you dropped in.
Yes, thank you.
And shared some of your thoughts of the 6 quotes. I think I partially quoted one and quoted another. So there's much more wisdom in there. I want to leave you with one thing, leave the listeners with one thing you said that really seemed meaningful to me. It says, so the undetermined point on a map is possible only after you fall off the first one. So it's pretty close to the quote.
Yeah.
And I hope everybody takes that to heart. I hope they read your book, find out what the title means. It's in the book, and they can get your book and read that. But I promise you, you'll enjoy it. You'll be challenged by it in some ways. And so it's good. But thank you for tuning in out there. And as always, be where you are, be who you are, and be at peace.
Thank you for joining us today on the Desert Sanctuary. We hope you find who you are as you embark on your own journey.
For all of us here at the Desert Sanctuary, be who you are, be where you are, and be at peace.